Well, hello there, and welcome to the Astrology Hub podcast. And I am so thrilled to be here today for this special report. We are going to be taking a look at the hot spots of the astrology of the next 2 weeks because the astrology is that big that it deserves a special report. And I'm here with a man who needs no introduction, at least not here at Astrology Hub. And this is Rick Levine in these fantastic glasses.
Well, it's because there's so much happening. These kaleidoscopic glasses give me like bee's eyes where I can see everything in every direction all at once. It's also giving me a headache.
All right. Well, Rick, thank you so much for being here for this special report. And I know we want to just dive in. So if you want to learn from Rick, he is going to be the Inner Circle Expand teacher for the upcoming lunation. So we're actually running a special promotion where you can get in for Rick's month and take his Mercury Masterclass, have his new and his full moon forecast, have the live Q&A, your opportunity to get your chart read by Rick, all these amazing things. So just go to astrologyhub.com/join expand to get all the details on this promotion. All right, Rick, let's talk about the astrology of the next 2 weeks. Why is it so important? What's going on?
Well, it seems to me as an astrologer, since the 1960s, astrologers have been saying, this is the most amazing year ever. This is the most amazing month ever. This is the most amazing week ever. Well, the next couple of weeks are all of those. And as you know, I'm often one that downplays that kind of perspective a bit.
Yes.
It actually bothers me the level of this is it, kind of like the end of the world is near, kind of. Even astrologers often fear-based, even though they say they're not. Often there's this whole sense of apprehension around what's coming up. And as you know, going back a few months, I and many, many other astrologers were already looking at the beginning of the Republican National Convention that opened on July 15th, give or take a few days because of the exactness of the conjunction of Mars and Uranus. Although that's an every other year conjunction, the fact that it was conjoined the fixed star Algol and that whole mythology. And of course, that turned into not just one event. And of course, it can't be forgotten that that although there's a whole story around Algol not necessarily being as treacherous as it might be if the feminine energy wasn't suppressed, and that's a whole deep dive. We've talked about that before. But the fact is that it's known as a star of decapitation, and because it's the beheaded Medusa. And of course, within a couple of days, we had of the exactness of that, but tied up right in that energy, we had a near decapitation of Donald Trump. And if you want to look at it, a total decapitation of Joe Biden. And, again, you see this energy. In fact, it was the same a different transit, but to transits on the day that the Supreme Court stopped the counting of the hanging chads in Florida that, quote unquote, decapitated Al Gore, not Al Gol, but Al Gore. And it was Saturn conjuncting Al Gore's Venus, which by birth was conjunct Al Gol. So coming off of that, most astrologers agree that if someone came to them at the beginning of the year and said, hey, I got this major event over the summer, I don't know when I'm going to hold it, but are there any dates I should avoid? Most astrologers would have looked at the charts for the summer and go, yeah, stay clear of July 15th and August 19th. Now, July 15th is in the past, but I love predicting the past. It's a lot more. Niels Bohr once said prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. And July 15th is obviously in the past, but August 19th is not. And although August 19th is the, at the time of the Democratic National Convention, I think it's the second day. I'm not sure it's the start. I don't have those notes in front of me right now. But it's not just that day. It's the middle of August is an incredibly dynamic moment in an incredibly dynamic summer, in an incredibly dynamic year and decade of humanity's evolution, transformation, transmutation, and so on. And so to talk about this before it happens, what's going to happen? I don't have a clue. I like to tell people, I'm an astrologer, not a prophet. And there are astrologers and people who make predictions. The word predict simply means to say before. And we are going to be saying things before, but I'm not going to be saying what will happen. I'm going to be describing why this week or week and a half or so is so energetically potent. And, as astrologers, we look at events and typically the rules are the slower moving the planet, the more potent the energy. That's why Pluto transits are more powerful than, let's say, a moon transit. And then the rarer the repeating pattern is, the more potent it is. That's why something that happens every other year, like a Mars-Uranus conjunction, even though events often tie and tick to that with great reliability, when something extraordinary is surrounding it that makes it different than everyone that's ever happened before, then it becomes more potent. Like a full moon, for example, which we have on August 19th, and we'll get there in a moment. But the thing about the attempted assassination of Donald Trump on the 13th, as Mars was approaching its conjunction with Uranus, Mars in traditional astrology is a malefic. It doesn't mean it's a bad planet, but it's a planet that gets out of control easily and quickly. It's hot under the collar. Mars tends to be reactive, and when it's reactive, it's often impulsive. Think Aries energy. It's often angry based upon the more anger or feelings that have been suppressed, the more it explodes. And as the also the ruler of Scorpio, there's often intense and powerful, passionate feelings that are tied up with whatever the expression is. So we look at Mars towards the middle of August, and Mars now moving through Gemini. Remember, when it aligned with Uranus on July 15th, it was at the end of Taurus. And as it moved into Gemini, things began to move on a lot of levels, individually, personally, collectively, politically. There's just movement. And it's a bit fragmented because Mars in Gemini, unlike Mars in Taurus, that is going to get to where it's going, but it looks like it's going slowly. Mars in Gemini is going everywhere all at once. It's that movie, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, All the Time, whatever that was, that. So on July 15th, Mars lined up with Uranus. On August 14th, Mars lines up with Jupiter in Gemini. And it's still within orb of that alignment for days before and still within orb for days after. That's the first important thing to consider. And when Mars and Jupiter align, this is often considered to be a pretty cool thing because Mars gets pumped up with Jupiter. Mars energizes the expansive optimism, opportunism, the potential of Jupiter. And you think of a Mars-Jupiter conjunction as the planets you want to conjure up if you're going out onto a playing field in a sporting event, or if you're going to the bank and you want a loan, it's confident. It's even overconfident because it's so pumped up. And with Mars lining up with Jupiter, there's that sense of kind of like almost like taking on so much energy because you feel your energy level's high and you feel lucky. It's that thing from, I think it was Dirty Harry, do you feel lucky? It's that kind of energy where we just feel like whatever we do is going to work. Now, here's the problem. We have Mars and Jupiter at 16 degrees of Gemini lining up exactly on the 14th. Actually, it's in the morning on the 14th. We have Saturn, which is retrograding, so it's moving backward relatively slowly. Saturn is at 17 degrees of Pisces. What that means is that both Mars and Jupiter at 16 degrees of Gemini is square to Pisces, so we have Mars and Jupiter coming into a square to Saturn. Mars-Saturn stuff is difficult because these are the two traditional malefics. They're difficult to work with for different reasons. Mars is so hot, it's sometimes hard to control. It's angry. And Saturn is so authoritative, it holds the energy back. And so we have Mars coming into a square with Saturn that's exact on the 15th. All these dates are going to be intertwined with each other. And it's my contention that any one of these dates is not what's important. It's the flow of these larger sequence. I think one of the mistakes, and I hear this even from the best astrologers, I fall into it even myself when I do my monthly updates. We sometimes isolate, here's a day when Mars is squaring Saturn, August 15th. Mars is hot, Saturn's cold. We may feel like we're being obstructed because we're ready to go forward, but Saturn is in some way presenting, some sort of resistance. This is all true, but events always occur as part of a larger flow. And we got to remember that Mars is also being lined up with Jupiter. And so there's this overinflated kind of confidence. And at the same time, because Jupiter moves a bit slower than Mars, Jupiter is coming into a square with Saturn that won't be exact until August 19th. That's the date of the full moon. We'll get there in a moment. So we have Jupiter and Mars conjoining. And Mars then makes a square with Saturn, and then Jupiter makes a square with Saturn. The Mars square Saturn happens, Mars conjoins squares, opposes squares, conjoins square every couple of years. I mean, it's a regular event. But again, it's not a regular event when Mars is conjoining Jupiter and there's all this extra energy pumping into it. And then we look at the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, and that's a very different cycle because Jupiter and Saturn, that cycle is a 20-year cycle that Jupiter aligns with Saturn and conjoins Saturn. And it basically does it. It's what creates the decades in our calendar. Jupiter, give or take 6 months or a year, Jupiter conjoined with Saturn, 1900, 1920, 1940, 1960, 1980, 2000, actually it was 2001, 2020, and the 2021 was very important because that what was part of what we call the grand mutation cycle, when it was actually the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in December of 2020 in Aquarius, shifting the energy into an air pattern where it had been in an earth pattern prior to that. So the Jupiter square Saturn, remember, squares are always part of a larger cycle. If we look at the moon cycle, at a new moon, we plant the seed. At the full moon, it's fruiting. It's maximum culmination, fruition. And then it's waning till back to the new moon. When we add in the quarters, the first quarter and third quarter, Dane Rudhyar, who introduced a lot of this material into modern astrology, much of it coming from the old Wiccan witchy traditions, but the first quarter moon is basically a crisis in action. In other words, what was planted at the seed, that would be in this particular Jupiter-Saturn cycle, December of 2020. And we know what was going on in 2020, beginning with the other seed that was planted in 2020, and that was the Saturn-Pluto conjunction back in January. So 2020 was capped by a Saturn-Pluto conjunction at the beginning and a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at the end. Jupiter is now coming into a square with Saturn, and this square will happen 3 times over the next year. The first will be on August 19th, but we're looking at a slow-moving cycle, so it's going to take days, weeks to build up. I mean, literally, we're already in this now. I mean, we already feel it. We've already been feeling it. But then because of the retrogradation of Jupiter, that pattern will repeat again on Christmas Eve Day, one of my favorite holidays. On December 24th, that'll be the second Jupiter-Saturn square, and the third one will be mid-June of 2025, June 15th. What does this mean? Well, Jupiter is about expansion. Saturn is contraction. When Jupiter and Saturn contract and hold together and there's a balance, a focus between expansion and contraction, we have these decades where we seem to be outwardly expanding. Jupiter's on the growth. And then at the halfway point, at the 90-degree angle, which is what we're coming to right now, there's a crisis in this outward manifestation that will then decide what is it that we carry forward, what is it that we drop away. That will then reach culmination. And then on the far side, that closing quarter is, according to Dane Rudhyar, a crisis in consciousness. It's no longer about what we do or don't do. It's what thoughts and what ideas do we get to carry back around to the dark of the next new moon. So one can imagine at this point in time that we're having this incredible dance between, do we hit the gas or do we hit the brake? It's Mars square Jupiter. How fast can we go around this curve? That would be Mars before we hit the guardrail, if there is one, or go over the edge. That would be Mars going too fast and Saturn not doing its job of holding the energy in. So that's the Mars-Saturn portion of it. The Jupiter-Saturn part of it is about expansion and contraction. In some ways, not in every way, but in some ways, Jupiter is big, blue, liberal, and democratic. And in some ways, Saturn is contractive, serious, conservative, red, and I don't mean red as in hot red, but I mean politically red, and Republican. It's not a complete metaphor that works for sure. But when you look at these years, as you go back in history, and you see that, you know, that the 20s were expansive and the 30s were contractive, and that the 40s were expansive. We're on the world stage. It was not necessarily good, but expansive. The 50s were quiet and contractive. The 60s were expansive. The 70s were contractive, and so on. That means that from 2020 to now, that was the last Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. We're in this kind of growth phase. There's an expansive energy. But at the square, there's a, how do we hold it in so that the growth isn't too much, too hard, too fast, getting ready for the 2030s, which in some way may be more contractive than the 2020s are or will have been from that perspective. These are huge things. This is not just what happens on one day. It's defining the whole background of what's happening out there. And so as this Jupiter square to Saturn occurs with Mars firing it up, that's very, very significant as we look at this period of mid-August. Now, into that, we also have the fact that Mars was conjoining Uranus back at the beginning of the Republican National Convention, and that when planets conjoin Uranus, they often release energy suddenly. There's that surprise, that shock, that awe, that revolution, that often genius, often breakthrough, often innovation. But it's almost always shock, surprise. And Uranus is electrical. In fact, on the day that Biden sent the social media release that he was not going to be in the presidential race anymore, that was correspondent with Mercury making a square to Uranus. We see these, so we had, the Mars conjunct Uranus on, within a couple of days of the assassination attempt, but Mercury communication squaring Uranus on the day of the announcement of Biden's decapitation. And I don't mean that physically, but you know what I mean. So what's intriguing is that as the sun is moving toward latter degrees of Leo through August, as it's ready to move into Virgo, the sun will make that same square that Mercury made to the sun on August 19th, the day of the full moon that we'll get there in just a moment. And in fact, let's jump conceptually to the 19th, because on the 19th, actually it's just before noon at 11:25 a.m., we have the full moon in Aquarius that is at 27 degrees 15 minutes of Aquarius, that is opposite the sun at 27 degrees of Leo and 15 minutes. And where's Uranus that day? We already said the sun is square Uranus. That means the full moon is square Uranus. What that means is that Uranus is at 27 degrees of Taurus. And so we have this full moon, not exactly, but partile within a quarter of, within minutes of arc, within like 6-7 minutes of arc. That's like 1/10 of a degree. We have the full moon and the sun squaring Uranus. Shock, surprise, sudden release of tension, definitely some craziness. Again, Uranus is the key player here because Uranus is technically at the midpoint of the sun and the moon. If you have a full moon, a tug of war, and you have a planet 90 degrees to both of them, it's halfway to each of them. And so Uranus is the mediator here. What's the mediator? Pop, lightning, striking. Now with Mars conjoined Uranus, Mars is often violent and explosive physically. I mean, going back to the 13th, 14th, 15th of July. This is the sun and the moon square Uranus. And so it's not as focused physically, but it's more visceral in as much as it's what the energy that's feeding everything, and it's how we're reacting and responding to it. Now, that in itself would make for a crazy, tremendous, powerful, intense full moon. But let's go back to the Mars conjunct Jupiter that's squaring Saturn. Remember, Mars exactly squared Saturn just a couple of days ago. We're talking now from the point of view on Monday, the August 19th. But from Monday, August 19th, Mars squared Saturn back on the 15th. And so that would have been several days back. The 15th was last Thursday. So that would have been exact. But even today, I say today as if we're talking about this from the perspective of August 19th. Even from today's perspective, Mars is still conjunct Jupiter within 2.5 degrees of orb. I mean, it's still there. It's still in operation. And so on that exact day, we now have Jupiter making the exact square to Saturn. And on top of that, from the other side, we have Venus in Virgo making an opposition to Saturn and a square to Jupiter and Mars. So in effect, we have two T-squares.
Wait, so this is all on the 19th?
All on the 19th. And the actual Venus thing, the Venus square to Jupiter is on the 18th, and the Venus square to the Mars is on the 22nd. But it's all right in that same focused period of time. Again, on the 19th, Venus is at 18, Saturn is at 17, Jupiter is at 17, and Mars is a whole 2 degrees away at 20. It gets there in a couple of days. And so we have having one T-square on a full moon, with the full moon T-squaring a planet, meaning mutually squaring Uranus, that's big. But we also have Venus opposing Saturn, and Venus and Saturn are both squaring the Mars-Jupiter conjunction. This is crazy. This is unreal as to how much conflictive energy is tied up in the moment. But again, remember, conflictive energy is not bad. It's only bad if we use it unconsciously, or if it uses us. If we're paying attention to it, this becomes the most creative and dynamic chance we have to take energy and do something with it. And so, in some ways, I'm looking at this day as just, an incredible day. Oh, and there's one other thing I need to come back to, and that is the full moon at 27 degrees of Aquarius square Uranus at 27 degrees Taurus. We have retrograde Mercury retrograding back over the sun, and the actual date of the actual conjunction itself, I think, is the day before. It's going to be August 18th. So it would be about 12 hours prior to the full moon itself. We have the cazimi of Mercury. In other words, Mercury lining up with the sun. Why is this so significant? Well, because the Mars-Jupiter conjunction is in Mercury's home sign of Gemini, and Venus, which is squaring that, is in Mercury's other home sign of Virgo, and they're both being restrained by Saturn, the structure. What's this going to be? I don't know, but I've never seen a chart quite like this. Unless we project forward a few years to the summer of 2026, which we talked about offline, and that's going to become a focal point for astrologers over the next, year or so. So that's my short opening volley. I mean, has there ever been a day with that much going on, with that level of intensity tied around such a major political event? And, I was a student in college. I was a sophomore at the time of the Democratic National Convention in 1968 in Chicago. And anyone who doesn't know what went on, Google it. It was the subject of an amazing documentary. There was a trial, the Chicago 8 trial, that came out of that was on the front page of the paper, almost all the big papers, almost every day for a good year and a half or so after this event. It was a riot in the streets, and it was a definite turning point, in American politics for sure. What will this convention be? I don't know, but it ain't over.
Rick, do you agree that with all of this astrology, and I'm talking like July through November 5th or towards the end of the year, and with the United States chart, that the major storyline is around American politics between now and through the end of the year?
Yeah. I would say that. And I would say that from a global perspective, though, meaning right, that we could say it's about American politics, but fortunately and unfortunately, American politics are global politics. And that the whole world, when you look at what's going on in other countries, everyone's looking at the United States now as to what the hell is going on in the United States. And certainly there's a lot of fallout, especially with the focus. And I think this may be some of the focus at the Democratic National Convention about the United States is, let's say, their political alliances with Israel and what's going on with Palestine and Israel, and the anti-capitalist, anti-colonial movement that's global right now. That's not just about what's going on in American politics. It's not even what's going on this month or even this year. There's some larger transformation that I think is part of this transformation of the Pluto moving into Aquarius, and the Neptune moving into Aries, and the Uranus moving into Gemini, all these outer planets over the next couple of years. The shift is way larger than any of us imagine. We look at astrology through what's happening today. What's the event? How's this going to impact my life? What's going to happen in my relationship, in my job? What's going to happen in the election in November? This is way bigger than all of those things. And what happens in the mesocosm, the current moment, may or may not be what we think it is as the larger events unfold. And that's the thing to keep in mind, that what we're really living here is a trajectory that may not be days, weeks, months, election date, boom, 4 years, that's what it is. No, the trajectory we're on can go back to the 60s, back to the World War II in the 40s, back to World War I, back to the founding of the United States and the French Revolution and the American Revolution. There's a longer trajectory here that is very hard to see, because when you're in the middle of an event, everything collapses on that event. And that's one of the downfalls and one of the dangers of practicing what I call Newtonian mechanical astrology, meaning everything is cause and effect, and they're just billiard balls. The planets are bouncing around and bumping into each other. And we have a Mars conjunct Uranus or a Mars conjunct Jupiter, and that's the way we read the whole event. It's a long trajectory, and this is a dynamic point in it.
So you're talking about a pattern that was seeded a long time ago, that we're living a chapter of the story, essentially.
That's right. And we're living a chapter. We're living in a chapter in a story that's in a story in a book that's not part of a trilogy, but it's maybe a volume of 40 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. That's still only one point of view in a much larger story. So yes. Okay. And I think that especially with Pluto moving into Aquarius, and especially since it's now tipping back into Capricorn just for a bit to do the remedial, let's take down everything that it hasn't taken down yet when it comes to all of these structures that have outlived their purpose. Let's not forget that when Uranus was discovered and when Pluto moved into Aquarius, these were the first inklings of individual freedom, as opposed to a monarchy being divinely gifted with the ownership of an entire country and all the people in it.
A couple questions here. Would you say that the events of July, mid-July, are also a part of this bigger pattern, or is this okay?
Oh yeah. And that's why I said it's important to understand that it's not just about Mars conjuncting Jupiter in mid-August. It's that Mars just got done conjuncting Uranus, and we know what happened then. There was an assassination attempt on a former president and a presidential candidate. There was a presidential candidate who, after being nominated, turned down the nomination, first time in history that's happened. There was also the largest singular internet outage that has ever happened that brought the entire planet to a damn standstill. Boom, nothing happened. I mean, it was just like, and even the media is still kind of downplaying the impact of that, and how that in itself may be a foreshadowing of something that we have not yet grappled with. And there are several other events that have occurred within that I think is simply too, it's too much granularity. It takes us away from the bigger thing. But those are some of the things that are all within this. And these are all as Mars was moving through the very end of Taurus, and boom, it moved into Gemini. But remember, Jupiter has moved from Taurus into Gemini, and that will be followed next year by Uranus moving from Taurus into Gemini. So yes, all these things are interrelated, and they keep bringing up the same things. And these planets are also this month making contact with Pluto. And when the planets over this past year, well, actually for the past century, almost, as the planets have made contact with Uranus and Pluto, this has flared up the events in the Mideast. Remember that Mars, Pluto, and Mars Uranus also corresponded with those, with the potential of what still may occur from that. And that's part of this whole scenario. But there's one other thing I want to say before I forget, and that is that Biden's announcement of his rescinding, I don't know what the word is, he turned down the nomination as transiting Mercury was squaring natal Uranus. Well, that transiting Mercury squaring natal Uranus was exact on July 21st. Because it's retrograding now in mid-August, it will square Uranus again within a day of this new moon on August 18th. The new moon is on the 19th. So
wait, you mean full moon? You mean full moon?
I'm sorry. I mean full.
Okay. I was like, wait, how is that happening? Okay, gotcha.
No, thank you so much. This is why I'm not rerunning for president. I'm kidding. No, a full moon. But on the day of the full moon, actually the day prior, the evening prior, the fact that Mercury is making that square to Uranus again, it's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in connection to all the planets that have made aspects to Uranus in these recent months, but in particular to Mercury's last square to Uranus on the day that Biden resigned, or he didn't resign.
Right. Declined the nomination.
Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. Declined. And so that on that same aspect, on the opening of the Democratic National Convention, it's very intriguing that that same energy is there. But then Mercury will back all the way up back into Leo, and then it will go direct again, and it makes its third and final square to Uranus while it's still backed up into Leo on September 6th. And so September 6th, which is still a couple of months prior to the election, there's some other thing that's tied to this. It's not a done deal, but all these events are interrelated, and they're all interrelated with the larger, slower moving events like the Jupiter square Saturn, which remember is 3 times, and it won't play through until next June, until well after whatever happens on election day has already played through. So this is not just about an election. It's about a much larger piece of evolutionary process.
Question. And I haven't heard you speak about this, but have you looked at the astrology of the day of the debate between Trump and Biden? Is that tied into this unfolding story too?
Yes, I don't have the chart in front of me and I can't remember, but of course it is.
Yeah, I mean, that seemed like a tidal shift point too.
It was on June 27th.
I'm curious because you're bringing in this Mercury piece, and Mercury, the mind and communication, and it just seems fitting that it would tie into the overarching storyline, especially as it relates to Biden.
Yeah. There's one other piece of this that we didn't talk about, and I'll come back to in a moment. The debate date, I have that chart in front of me. But another thing that's unfolding this year, remember we talked about the Jupiter in its opening square to Saturn and how that would reflect back to the events of 2020 and the seeds that were sown around the end of 2020 at the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And at the beginning of 2020, we had the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which of course is a much deeper, lower note. Saturn and Pluto were aligned around the time of the formation of the United Nations and around the time of the discreation of Palestine and the legal formation of Israel, 47-48. And the Saturn-Pluto conjunction also occurred in the summer of 1914, within a few days of the assassination of Duke Ferdinand that started World War I. And that same conjunction occurred at the beginning of 2020 that I don't refer to as the year of COVID. I refer to it as the year of quarantine, because there was something there about a global event that locked everything together. But the intriguing thing is that we are also right now in the midst of 3 half squares between Saturn and Pluto that began back in May of this year, May of 2024, and won't play through until early next year. But it's just another heavyweight energy, because anyone who's followed my work knows that semi-squares, that's 45 degrees, are not weaker than squares. They're more focused, they're more precise, but they're not weaker. They're more motivational. They're more action oriented. So that's occurring also. And it was during that debate on June 27th that the moon was aligned with Saturn. The moon in Pisces was aligned with Saturn, the holding back, the restriction, the running into a wall. And Mercury was 1/3 of a circle at 19, actually it was at 21, a degree away of Cancer. And so there was a flow of energy from Mercury to Saturn that night, but not to Uranus. But there was also a square between Mercury and Chiron, and that has to do with old wounds coming to the surface. So know that Uranus was not necessarily strictly activated that evening, but other things were.
It sounds to me like what's happening mid-August is a whole configuration of events that is it's hard for me to use this word unprecedented now after the overuse of it in 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, it's precedented. We just don't know what the precedent was.
Okay, right, exactly. So a very auspicious and something to pay attention to mid-August. Same was happening in July. Is it more in August? Are there more aspects of it that are worthy of paying attention to?
I think August has more inclusion, on more complexity. There's another thing that's going on in August also that has to do with the faster moving planets moving from Leo into Virgo. And Mercury was the first one that did that. I'm speaking from the day of mid-August. Mercury moved from Leo into Virgo on July 24th. And as it did that, it made quincunxes with Pluto, because remember, Pluto's at 0 degrees of Aquarius, and with Neptune. Neptune is at minus 1/4 of a degree of Aries, meaning really 29 3/4 of Pisces. And so Mercury made what's called a finger of God, or a yod. It was, so we have Neptune sextiling Pluto at the base, and Mercury, as it hit 29 degrees Leo into 0 degrees of Virgo on July 24th, exacerbating that, just totally bringing that up into action. And then we had Venus doing the exact same thing, as Venus moved from Leo into Virgo on August 4th, the day that Mercury began to turn retrograde. And so Venus on August 3rd and 4th made quincunxes with Neptune and Pluto, again making that point of the yod. And then as the sun changes signs, and as Mercury retrogrades back into Leo, that happens on August 15th, Mercury retrogrades back into Leo. And once again, it makes quincunxes with Neptune and Pluto. And I'll say more about what those quincunxes all mean. I've just finished the last one to this, because then the sun moves from Leo into Virgo on August 21st, making those same quincunxes. And then Mercury, which turns direct, Mercury then for the final point moves out of Leo and into Virgo on September 8th, 9th. Now, what do these mean? This means that the underlying feeding of these energies of these two slowest moving planets, Neptune, our dreams, our illusions, our fantasies, our hopes, the metaphysical parts of our imagination that are out there, and Pluto, the magic of what gets transformed in those realms as things become unreal and then real again. That process of decay and then recreation, that what happens in the hell realms, whether it's the physical being going through the Bardo states or through the non-physical dimensions, or whether it's a caterpillar going through the metamorphosis in in the chrysalis stage, or whether it's in a human in any deep process going into that dark night of the dark moon or the dark night of the soul. And so all of these different dates that happen with three different planets, Mercury, Venus, and the Sun, but happens 3 times with Mercury, so it's 5 times, are all emphasizing the instability and the inability to make sense out of this whole deeper process. So yes, what's happening now is a re-emphasis on what's gone on before, but it's also at a different level because of how many, it's almost like a confluence of like different tributaries feeding into the ocean, and they're all coming together in like Chesapeake Bay or in in some big harbor or bay before they hit the ocean and begin to disperse. There's a lot going on, and I think that's the bottom line, and that makes it difficult to call, except it makes it very easy to say that something's going to happen or some things are going to happen, because likely it won't be one event, and it doesn't even mean that it'll be one thing that will be clear. It will mean that there's, again, this confluence of things that are coming together that I think can change the flow of the river. It can be enough energy that will break a dam or fertilize ground that's never been watered or flood a seaboard. Which will happen? I'm not at liberty to say because I don't know.
Okay. So some of the words that I heard you say throughout this whole talk: conflictive energies.
Squares. The physicist will say that a 90-degree angle is the angle of maximum destruction. Now that sounds horrible, but what it means is that if there are 2 waves and they meet at 90 degrees, the resultant wave has less to do with either of the 2 initial waves than any other angle. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It means that, in fact, the creativity can create a new wave that is so powerful because it's being fed by these 2 different waves. And so that's the power of squares. The danger is to think that squares are bad. Yes, they're conflictive, but conflict means engagement, and engagement means dialogue. It means flow of information back and forth. And although it's easy sometimes to just take out the hammer or a gun, if you have one available, that is not the highest use of this. And yet the potential from these squares is huge, because maximum destruction doesn't mean destruction of everything. It means destruction of the 2 conflicting waves into a form that is a new wave that is taking the power of both of those individual waves. And we have those conflictive squares. We have those from the moon to Uranus, the sun to Uranus, from Saturn to Jupiter, from Saturn to Mars, from Venus to Saturn, from Venus to Mars. In other words, because there are these 2 different T squares, we have an enormous amount of conflictive energy, and yet the opposition in a T square also creates a sense of awareness or a potential for awareness. But yes, conflict, yes.
Okay. Conflictive, unstable, unpredictable.
That would be the Uranus part, yeah.
Yep. And what I heard too was you used the river analogy, but foundation shifting. These are sort of at the core shifts versus little ripples, I guess is what I'm saying. They have the potential to shift the entire foundation.
Yeah.
Okay. Rick, thank you. Thank you for all of this. I mean, that's just, it's a lot. It's a lot of information, but it's helpful to understand the complexity of what's going on and why you've been saying it's so important.
And I think that most of the other astrologers that I've heard, and this is not to take anything away from what anyone does, that's the magic and beauty of astrology, but most of the other astrologers have been looking at these individual isolated dates. And I feel like sometimes I'm on a one-man campaign, to change our perspective of the planets from particles to waves, the particle-wave duality. And I'm trying to look at this event or these events, not as events, but as event scenarios. They're not things that are going to happen. They're event scenarios that will occur in part of a larger flow. And it's a very, very strong turning point or a very dynamic point in this.
I think that is really important context and important for all of us to remember that we're a part of a larger story, that it's continually unfolding.
And in closing, I don't know if we're ready to close or not, but in closing, I would like to just reiterate something that I have said before. And that is, when times are so dynamic, these are not times to go home, pull the covers over your head, have a cup of tea and not answer the phone. These are times to, in whatever little way you can, to do whatever you can to alter the fabric of reality closest to you. I often say, think cosmically, act locally. But, that means helping someone, into their car with a bag of groceries that they can't do. It means going out of the way and doing something nice for someone around you. It means looking at the world and seeing some of those things that are occurring that are horrific and saying, I can't change the policy all at once, but I can write a letter or 20 to my congressmen, senators, whatever, or I also can donate money to help someone somewhere. Because by the time we move through these most dynamic times, by the time we get to 2025 and 2026, this dynamic energy is going to settle down, and it's going to be too late to affect the change that we might think that we need to affect today. And we do. Whatever it is, whatever your involvement or interest is on whatever level, I would encourage you to think of the spiritual high road, whatever that means. Think compassion. Think opening up whatever boundaries you have created for yourself. I don't care what side of what spectrum you're on. Open those boundaries so that you can see things oppositionally because an opposition is just two sides of the same coin. And when we have an opposition, like a full moon on the 19th of August, or the Venus opposing Saturn on the 18th of August, an opposition is like a tug of war, and there's two sides of a coin. And what we tend to do is we look at one and we block out the other. And yet this is an opportunity to open our peripheral vision. It doesn't mean we need to change our assumption. It means that we need to open up our vision so we can see both sides, because there is another side, whether we're seeing it or not. And that then begins the potential for creating dialogue and commerce, intellectual commerce, not just monetary commerce, to actually create potential resolution, because that's going to shut down. We are still in a point of maximum dynamics. Get off your lazy butt. I'm saying that to me too, and do something.
Rick, thank you. That's super powerful and great reminders and great encouragement for all of us. And I don't know about all of you, but in July, when things were chaotic, having the foresight of the astrology, because you all were saying like some big stuff's going down, it enabled me to be a lot more calm as the things were unfolding, and I think as part of our responsibility as those who do tune into the astrological tides, we're forewarned in some way. In some ways, our system has already worked through some of the chaos by the time we actually get there, because we were anticipating it on some level. So even just being that person that someone can turn to and just be like, what the heck is, they're wondering what's going on. Why is this happening? Having the context of the astrological storyline can be really calming for people.
We need to step out of our fear mode of personal protection and vulnerability into a longer trajectory that includes those around us.
Yes, exactly. Okay, Rick, please, for our Inner Circle members and anyone who's going to join the Inner Circle for your month, tell us about your Mercury Mastery class. What are you going to be teaching? Why do you think it's important for students to learn about it? Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, look, without Mercury, we would not be having this conversation. We sometimes, we astrologers talk about the emerald tablets And you know where those come from. Hermes, the thrice great. Hermes is Greek for Mercury, which is Latin for Hermes. And so Hermes is the original giver of truth. And in modern astrology, Mercury sometimes gets, he's the winged messenger. He's frivolous. He's funny. Mercury's not a he. Mercury is a hermaphrodite. So Mercury is a they, technically the first they. And Mercury often, though, is considered to be witty. Mercury is clever. Mercury is how we say and how we listen. But Mercury is the giver of intellect, of thoughts, of words. And we forget that in the myth of Persephone, it was Mercury who was sent into the underworld to rescue Persephone, because Mercury is the only planet that lives both comfortably here and there. And what do I mean by here? I mean everything that is conscious and aware and on the upside, so to speak. And what do I mean by there? I mean Pluto. I mean everything that's in the underworld, everything that's hidden, everything that's unconscious. And Mercury, as a psychopomp in the Greek mythology, Mercury was a guide that helped souls find their way as they were journeying between these two worlds. And so even the concept of talk therapy is basically using Mercury, thought, intellect, to go into the underworld, the unconscious, bring things out into the open by talking about them so we can transform them, so that we can become aware of them, so that we're not ruled by our hidden ghosts and goblins and demons. So Mercury is incredibly important. And my talk is going to be less on delineating Mercury in each sign, although we'll talk some about that, than it is really trying to get to know Mercury a bit better, and why Lois Rodden, who was the original data collector and created the whole rating system that we astrologers use to classify data. When we have good data, we call it double A data in the Rodden data classification. And Lois Rodden wrote a book called The Mercury Method of Chart Comparison, in which she made a claim that if two people's Mercuries weren't connected, forget about a relationship. Now, that may or may not have be slightly overstated, but it just kind of reinforces the importance of Hermes, of language, of Mercury, of words, in the Nordic tradition, of the runes, of that which gives thought and mentality and intellect that is not physical consciousness, but still intellectual.
Okay. So you can go to astrologyhub.com/join expand. When you join in time for Rick's month, which is when you join by the end of August 31st, you will get access to the mastery class on Mercury. You will get access to an exclusive new and full moon forecast from Rick. You'll get access to an exclusive live Q&A and chart reading demonstration with Rick, in which he chooses students' charts to actually demonstrate some of the techniques that he teaches in the mastery class. He'll be engaged in the online community and answering your questions. So, and you'll get cosmic updates. There's all kinds of things that you get as a part of the inner circle. So if you want to join us for Rick's month, we are running a promotion right now. You can go to, again, astrologyhub.com/join expand, get in for Rick, stay for a while if you'd like to, or just enjoy Rick's month. So it's up to you. And Rick, you're amazing. Thank you so much for this special report. This has been super helpful. And
thank you. And thank Astrology Hub for all that you do in creating a community that brings so many cool people together.
It's our pleasure.
And I'm happy to be one of them.
Yay. Awesome. So Rick, I'm so excited to be hanging out with you through all this really big astrology. Thank you for being our guide here today. Thank you all for being a part of our community. Thank you for making astrology a part of your life. As Rick always says, what's your thing?
Think cosmically, act very locally.
Love it. All right. Take care, everybody, and we'll see you soon.